When someone wants to play God, I think there's a formula, and here it is. You shut up. You follow the science, and I will tell you what the science is. I don't know what could be more important than making certain that in a society as diverse as ours, that we let no one play God. Hi, welcome back to the Dr. Scott Jensen podcast. As I've told you in the past, we're going to periodically put out podcasts and we're going to focus on issues of safety, accountability of government, freedom for all individuals, and free markets as well. We're going to talk about education and how that impacts. We're going to talk about tyrannical forces. And I think we always need to talk about that concept of a Yoda movement. Yoda, the figure in Star Wars, who said, do or do not, there is no try. Meaning, let's not cut ourselves too much slack and slide over to the sidelines and think it's okay. It's not okay. Today, I want to start out again with the comment I made before, and that is, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. Well, I want to tell the truth. I want to talk today about when humans play God. Historically, you would probably first think of the world of medicine in regards to a human playing God. I've practiced medicine for 40 years, and several of my family members have spent their careers in medicine. And occasionally, we do come across that. Are we playing God? I want to share a story that came from Time magazine back in the 1980s, and it was Doctor and Patients, Image versus Reality. I just want to read a few highlights because I've spoken often to the issue of relationship matters. I wrote a book about how important it is that the relationship between patients and doctors be functional, open and honest, whereby the physician is advocating for the patient and the patient is given the opportunity to trust the physician to be there in the patient's corner when needed. So that's what we're going to talk about. This is almost 40 years ago. It starts out like this. It was an article written by Nancy Gibbs in Time magazine, July 31st, 1989. Quote, I do not know a single thoughtful and well-informed person who does not feel that the tragedy of illness at present is that it delivers you helplessly into the hands of a profession which you deeply mistrust. It delivers you into the hands of a profession which you deeply mistrust. That was in the 1980s by George Bernard Shaw, a well-known playwright. If that was true then, what must it feel like today to be a patient after the last 3.5 years? So frequently where physicians playing God, pretending an omniscience that they don't earn or have or possess, and dismissing, betraying, and abandoning their patients in their time of need. Let's go on and read what else Time magazine had to say about physicians and relationships. It says this, nothing in medicine is stationary. The blinding speed of technological advances, the splintering effects of specialization, the onset of medical consumerism, the threat of malpractice suits have all bruised the doctor-patient relationship in recent years. There are rich ironies here. Never have doctors been able to do so much for their patients. Life expectancy has jumped during the century of the 1900s from 47 to 75. Do the math. That's a 50% increase in life expectancy. It goes on to say, the anger and suspicion toward doctors are easy to measure. In 1987, 37% of those polled did not believe doctors take a genuine interest in their patients. And yet, they may not be taking a genuine interest in their patients, but they are perceived as, at times, inappropriately playing God. A March 1986 survey of physicians in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area found that nearly 2/3 of physicians were pessimistic about their professional futures, and a like number said they would not want their children to go into medicine. The profession was fracturing even then, and things have gotten worse, I would say. How can patients trust a doctor who has a clear financial interest in prescribing expensive, intrusive, and perhaps unnecessary therapies? When doctors disagree, how can a patient know whom to believe? And then it goes on to talk about a phenomenon in the 70s and 80s. Many HMOs can be quite profitable, so long as their patients do not get too sick. Physicians, meanwhile, are transformed from professionals into employees with the duty to serve not only the interests of their patients, but the demands of the corporation as well. The government, as the largest health insurer, and the private insurance companies have tried to cap medical costs by deciding in advance how much a particular treatment should cost and balking at anything above that amount. Playing God. Medicare and insurance company guidelines, for example, forbid cardiologists to hospitalize patients for a coronary angiogram unless the patient is desperately ill. This was 30 to 40 years ago that we're reading this kind of text. And haven't things accelerated? When you can, under certain circumstances, play God, you sometimes tend to behave like you are God, says Cornell's David Rogers. No single factor has done more to distance physicians from patients than the possibility that a patient may one day put a doctor on the witness stand. And malpractice does matter. Many malpractice suits come because people are angry at their doctors for not communicating, said Cornell's Rogers. Consumer advocate Michael Rooney of the People's Medical Society agrees it's when they feel they've been hurt or betrayed that they sue. In Missouri, they're trying to teach students kindness and gentleness along with chemistry and anatomy in order to become humane doctors. How can doctors be humane when they find themselves taking a more rote approach, what some people call cookbook medicine? By following standard procedures as much as possible, the physician may hope to avoid any controversy that might arise in court. So you see, the combination of these factors, the welter of technology, the intrusions of corporate medicine, the high expectations of patients, and the threat of malpractice has cast a pall on the practice of many older physicians. Harvard professor Ronald Arkey said, doctoring still involves an intimate, close contact with the patient. Patients have every right to be concerned when it's possible that doctors may be playing God. And sometimes they do it almost mechanically. Think of the electronic health record. Think of how many patient visits occur where the doctor's back of his head or her head is what's facing the patient while the doctor looks at the computer screen. Think of what happened during the pandemic when patients were dismissed from a practice because they weren't doing what the doctor wanted. Think of the power and the impact of big pharma, as big pharma literally controlled our lives and certainly ramped up their revenues. And speaking of big pharma, I'd like to just comment on one other article from the 1980s. It was from Time magazine, and it says, good cholesterol. Good cholesterol. Encouraging news for your heart. Some 35 years ago, there's an article called Searching for Life's Elixir, and it talks about HDL, the good cholesterol. But what I think you need to be aware of is we've become so sensitized to cholesterol as an entity that has to be addressed that at times we've downplayed the need for exercise, potentially controlling your weight, and doing so many lifestyle changes that would be far more important than cholesterol. I have told my patients over and over again, I'd love to have your cholesterol controlled appropriately, but it's 10 times more important for you to give up your cigarettes. But why did cholesterol rise to the top? When people think about how to reduce your risk of heart disease, why is it cholesterol? Well, during the presidential campaign in 1988, George Bush's doctor issued a medical history that included the candidate's total cholesterol and his HDL levels. The shelves of the nation's grocery stores are lined with products conspicuously labeled cholesterol-free. This whole article talks about HDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. You can see that what this is presenting to us is the doors being opened for big pharma. And at the same time, this article on good cholesterol was published, you were seeing the first statin drug being released in the late 1980s, lovastatin. Since then, we've had half a dozen statin drugs, each one better than the last, each one deserving to be high-priced, trade name, proprietary medications, thereby denying patients the opportunity to pay far less for a previous, very acceptable, very effective statin drug, which has now become generic. That's the game Big Pharma plays. Do you think they're playing God? If you look at a website called NNT, and you look at what happens when you give statins for 5 years in people with known heart disease, what are the benefits? This article says 1 in 83 were helped. In other words, a life saved. That means 82 out of the 83 people did not receive any tangible benefit. It said, in terms of preventing stroke, if you have people on a statin for 5 years consecutive, 1 out of 125 people will have a stroke prevented, and 124 will have no effect. If you look at how many people need to be treated in order for harm to occur, this article says that 1 in 10 would experience some type of muscle damage, whether it was pain in the muscles, leaking of muscle enzymes from the muscles, but some type of muscle damage, 1 in 10. Now, the source for this website was Archives of Internal Medicine, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet. And it gives a caveat at the end of the article. It says, virtually all of the major statin studies were paid for and conducted by their respective pharmaceutical companies. A long history of misrepresentation of data and occasionally fraudulent reporting of data suggests that these results are often much more optimistic than subsequent data produced by researchers and parties that do not have a financial stake in the result. So that's where we're at. If this heightened awareness of cholesterol is so all important, if Big Pharma is right, that this is the thing we should pay attention to above all else, including sedentary lifestyles, obesity, smoking, then why does this graph reveal that premature deaths attributed to heart disease has decreased each decade for most groups, but remain unchanged among adults 25 to 34? Isn't that pretty important? And it's remained stagnant during the 2 most recent decades for adults 35 to 44. That means we're talking about the meat, if you will, of our working society, the people that get up in the morning and make things happen. Men and women between 25 and 45 have not seen a significant reduction in heart disease deaths prematurely. That matters. Are we seeing some insidious influence playing God? Record number of deaths in U.S. from cardiovascular disease early in pandemic. ABC News reported on January 26, 2023, this year, Jennifer Meow and Eden David wrote this article. Record number of deaths in the U.S. from cardiovascular disease. And it says this: at least 928,741 Americans died from cardiovascular disease in 2020. This tops the previous high of 910,000 deaths. So in other words, we're spending a boatload of money, experiencing a fair amount of side effects from statin drugs. And at some level, we can argue that we're getting marginal results. In regards to the heart disease deaths prematurely, I think it's important to note that over the last 3 years, things have gotten even worse. COVID-19 indirectly impacted cardiac health in a big way. People avoided going to the doctor's offices and hospitals. As one of the leaders, Dr. Michelle Albert, the president of the American Heart Association, said, we went into isolation. People were afraid to come into the hospital for care, and when people showed up for care, they showed up with more advanced disease. When it comes to playing God, certainly medicine is susceptible to that criticism. But they're not alone. They're not alone at all. Today, there was an article in the paper, and I made a photoshot of it. The White House releases a report on reflecting sunlight to cool the earth. Here are the key points of the article from CNBC. The White House released a federally mandated report on solar geoengineering, which is an umbrella term that describes methods of reflecting sunlight away from the earth to cool the atmosphere. The primary theme in the report focused on looking at solar geoengineering through a risk versus risk framework, meaning the risks of intervention versus no action. The report talks about heat being a worthy adversary, and it's often called the silent killer. Haven't we been familiarized with the term silent killer before, when tyrannical forces wanted to powerfully influence the mindsets of the citizen? The White House report focuses on two methods of solar geoengineering. Number one, stratospheric aerosol injection occurs when we release particles of sulfur dioxide or another substance into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight away from the earth. And the other method would be marine cloud brightening, is meant to improve the reflectivity of certain clouds by injecting salt or other materials into those clouds. Does it sound like we might be playing God? In a Star Tribune article recently, they talked about the fact that the damage that's been done by people playing God during the pandemic and telling kids, you don't get to go to school. Some kids missing school literally for almost 2 years. ACT scores have never been lower in the last 30 years, according to this strip, the Minneapolis Star Tribune. What we're seeing is we're seeing a tremendous amount of influences whereby with a certain amount of hubris or cockiness, people are willing to play God. When they do that, they put all of us at risk. The only way that we can uncover how this is happening is to talk about it. So when we see political interest trying to shut down voices, when we see censorship becoming the rule of the day, we've got a problem. There was a recent article that said, what should we do about Elon Musk? We should do nothing about Elon Musk. We should appreciate the fact that he purchased Twitter and has put it into a social platform that allows people to have true open discussions in the public square. But this article wanted to control him. They wanted to put up guardrails that he couldn't speak outside of. Why would we do that? Elon Musk is a fresh, intelligent voice. And so are many others, both sides of the aisle. Wise people have said, I will go to any length to protect the right of my opponent to say whatever they're saying. When we lose the ability to have these open conversations in the public square, what's happening is often someone's playing God. Whether we're talking about an premature, arbitrary approach to climate change, because in the article I mentioned, there's discussion about, is climate change the big problem or global warming? Isn't it clear that we don't know? Isn't it clear that the public square has got to continue to dissect this issue and have a conversation? And in the same way, when doctors decide for patients what they will do, and when pharma decides for doctors what they will do. I've been discussing the notion of playing God, particularly in the realm of healthcare, and I've talked about cholesterol. But there's another dimension that I haven't discussed yet, and it's scary. Do you remember a movie decades ago? I think a guy named Jeff Goldblum was in it, Jurassic Park. And the discussion was, do we dare think about altering DNA? Do we dare mess with the human genetic code? Take a look at this video clip.
Gee, the lack of humility before nature that's being displayed here staggers me.
Well, thank you, Dr. Malcolm, but I think things are a little bit different than you and I had feared.
Yeah, I know. They're a lot worse.
Now, wait a second. Now, we haven't even seen the part where Amy...
Don't let him talk. There's no reason. No, I want to hear every viewpoint. I really do.
Yeah, don't you see the danger John, inherent in what you're doing here. Genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun.
It's hardly appropriate to start hurling generalizations.
If I may, I'll tell you the problem with the scientific power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You know, you read what others had done, and you took the next step. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew what you had, you patented it and packaged it and slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and now you're selling it. You want to sell it. Well,
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
I think it's important to recognize that scientists can sometimes streak forward in their goals because of just pure scientific drive. But sometimes the ethical precepts upon which their work is done haven't been developed enough. Think of the opiate crisis. I can still remember the 1990s when Big Pharma convinced its sales force to convince doctors that a fifth vital sign should be introduced in addition to respiratory rate, heart rate, blood pressure, and temperature. And it should be pain control, 1 through 10. So every patient, they could come in with a hangnail, they could come in with a rash. What's your pain level? Because if doctors weren't addressing pain, that fifth vital sign, we weren't doing our job. Literally, we saw Purdue Drug Company and others create an epidemic of chronic pain in the U.S. That led to more opiate prescriptions than ever before. And in the last 12 months, in terms of record keeping, numerous newspapers have indicated that the United States exceeded 100,000 people dying of drug overdoses, the multitude of those, the majority of those being opiate overdoses. You might say, well, sometimes that's the price you pay in order to have good medicine. Let me just remind you that in the world, annual health spending per person matters. Right now, in this country, we spend $13,000 per person. And the next closest is Germany at $7,400, and then it drops to $6,000 in Sweden and France. And if you want to talk about, are we really getting what we're supposed to get? If you look at life expectancy, and you look at Japan, France, Australia, Sweden, Canada, Germany, United Kingdom, and the U.S., we're last. Japan, 88 years. United States, 79. So don't tell me that these benefits of Big Pharma playing God have delivered results. They haven't. Now, I think it's important to recognize that playing God crosses all spectra of society. You'll see it in politicians. You'll see it in doctors. You'll see it in industries. And when you see it, if you aren't paying attention, you got a problem. I wrote a book 8 years ago called Relationship Matters. And I want to comment on one page where I had a patient who was dying of gastric cancer, advanced, metastasized. She was vomiting blood, and it was clear she was in her last weeks or months of life. And I remember one of my colleagues in the hospital refused to approach that patient and ask how they would like to live their remaining days. When I confronted that doctor, why haven't you given your patient this opportunity? I admitted this patient of yours in the emergency room. She is sick, she's dying, she's anemic, she's vomiting blood, and she's ready to let nature take its course. And he said, we'll give her a week to get stronger and feel better and maybe get an interpreter over because she doesn't really understand the English language so much. But when I talked to that patient, this is what I think she would have said to me in my language. Until I die, honor my wishes. Well, I'm not honoring her wishes if I'm playing God and not letting her have the opportunity to tell me her wishes. When someone wants to play God, I think there's a formula. And here it is. You shut up. You follow the science. And I will tell you what the science is. I don't know what could be more important than making certain that in a society as diverse as ours, that we let no one play God. It's why I wrote a book called We've Been Played. In that, I try to dissect the tyrannical forces that are at work. Certainly big pharma, but big tech plays a role. And absolutely, big government does as well. I think we all can say that government's expanded its force and its impact through the last 3.5 years in a way that probably hasn't happened in our lifetimes before. So I wrote a book. We've been played, and we have. If you want to read it, you can go to drscottjensen.com. Go to our website. But the bottom line is, if someone's playing God, I don't think it's for godly reasons.